The Russian army is currently advancing in 3 theaters of operations: a main strike to the center of Donbas along a 62-mile arc from Chasiv Yar to Krasnohorivka, with 2 auxiliary strikes near Vuhledar in the southern Donbas and towards the Oskil River in the eastern Kharkiv, northern Donetsk and Luhansk regions. The greatest Russian advances have occurred in the areas to the west and east of Avdiivka, but any of these 3 attacks could become a success for the Russian army if Ukraine is forced to strengthen its defenses in the area by pulling men from another section of the front. For the past 10 months, by changing the direction of the attacks like this, Russia has managed a slow but steady and gradual advance. So in today's video, I'm going to discuss each of these 3 main axes of the Russian advance, based largely on a very insightful analysis from Medusa, and I'll also comment on the advantages and drawbacks that the Russian army will face. I'll also talk briefly about the prospect of a Ukrainian counteroffensive, should they be able to regain the initiative sometime next year, if the war progresses to that date. The Russian troops have held the battlefield initiative in Ukraine for the past 10 months, which is the longest that any side has had at any stage of this war. Such a sustained offensive became possible due to the Russian army's advantage in forces and munitions. This advantage arose for several reasons. 1. The UAF suffered heavy casualties during its defense of Bakhmut, particularly among its old brigades formed before the fall of 2022, and then again during its latest counter-offensive in 2023. Meanwhile, due to a series of defeats and the society's growing war fatigue, the influx of volunteers to the front started falling by mid-2023. Moreover, Ukraine's forced mobilization system was insufficient, leading the authorities to adopt various unpopular measures in May 2024 to draw more men into the military. Second was the US political opposition in the Congress, which halted the flow of new weapons and ammunition to Ukraine. Also, the US allocated funds for weapons deliveries to Ukraine did not exceed the amount spent in 2023. On the opposite, Russian authorities managed to boost the recruitment of volunteers by raising regional government payments to new soldiers. Additionally, the state suspended troops' contract termination and demobilization, thereby plugging a major drain on the army's size. By the spring of 2024, the Russian armed forces likely has a 1.5 to a 2-fold advantage in manpower and continued to be reinforced with new contract soldiers. Russia established a steady supply of artillery ammunition for its army by increasing production at home and buying supplies from North Korea. Medusa reports that the current trajectory of the war is unacceptable to Ukrainian authorities. From Kiev's perspective, the army needs to seize the initiative, launch another counteroffensive, and possibly force the Kremlin into negotiations, if not from a position of strength, then under better conditions than are possible now. Medusa writes that the only way to do this is to hold the line until the Russian military exhausts its offensive potential. While doing this, Ukraine must simultaneously form a new strike group, strengthening it with unmanned and manned aerial assets and developing an operation that can change the situation at the front. What was interesting to note is that the UAF appears to be busy forming 15 or more brigades in some places, at the expense of reinforcing units active at the front, which has led to criticism from some Western experts, though support from others. At the same time, the troops in the field have been ordered to hold their positions at all costs, another decision that has drawn significant criticism. But despite strict orders to hold the line at all costs, the UAF isn't just losing territory. Russian forces are approaching critical logistics hubs that the Ukrainians simply cannot afford to lose. Attempts to redeploy brigades from one crisis area to another, sometimes up to 3 times since the start of this year, do not improve the situation as the front is expanding. In February, after the fall of Avdiivka, the front line to the west of the city stretched for 25 kilometers. Today, the same area is now more than 40 kilometers long. Then we add Russia's new front to the north in Kharkiv, which added several dozen kilometers to the front line. This means that Ukrainian brigades are stretched, and Russia's control of the war's initiative means it can choose the direction of its offensive, and expanding the front benefits the Russian goals. So now let's look at the 3 primary axes of attack that the Russian army is currently engaged in, and also let's take a look at what's working for the Russians and what might work against them. Russian troops aim to either encircle or force out under the threat of encirclement Ukrainian troops in the developed area between Chasiv Yar and Avdiivka, known as the Toretsk agglomeration. A second direction is the road between Pokrovsk and Chasiv Yar and the city of Pokrovsk itself, which the article describes as the most important logistical hub for the UAF in the central part of Donbas. The advantages for Russia here is that a successful continuation of its offensive promises operational benefits for the Russian military. Capturing or even starting battles in the Pokrovsk area will drastically degrade the supply situation for the Ukrainian armed forces along the entire front from Krasnohorovka to Chasiv Yar. After the Russian armed forces reach the Pokrovsk-Chasiv Yar highway, of which they are already within less than 3 miles, Meduza reports that the Ukrainian front will be divided into 2 weakly connected parts, complicating Kiev's capacity to supply its troops and maneuver reserves. From the Pokrovsk area, Russia will be well positioned for an offensive into southern Donbas. From the Konstantinivka area, which is west of Chasiv Yar, an offensive could be directed north toward the Kramatorsk-Sloviansk direction. Russian troops have a stable supply network in this area, anchored by the city of Donetsk and its suburbs, with numerous warehouses and developed infrastructure. This allows Moscow to concentrate a significant portion of all its forces in Ukraine on this front. And to be honest, there isn't much of any drawbacks for Russia on this front, save for the fact that this would be, as the article described it, the most obvious plan with the worst potential consequences for the Ukraine armed forces. This is likely why Kiev will do everything it can to prevent a breakthrough here. The Ukrainian authorities understand that this area needs to be reinforced, likely at the expense of troops from other sections of the front. As we have seen throughout this war, obvious main attack paths have drawn enemy reserves until a battle turns into a meat grinder, as occurred near Bakhmut and in the Zaporizhian region in the UAF 2023 counteroffensive. As part of Moscow's multiple strike strategy, which aims to divert the attention of the Ukrainian armed forces from central Donbas, the Russian military periodically intensifies its offensive in the north from the city of Siversk in the Donetsk region to Kupiansk in the Kharkiv region. In May, to maintain pressure on this operation front, the Russian armed forces began an offensive across the border of the Belgorod and Kharkiv regions. In a best-case scenario, the article believes the Russians could have advanced from the north along both banks of the Oskil in the general direction of Sloviansk and Kramatorsk, as well as from the direction of Siversk and Bakhmut. But as the Ukrainians diverted reserves, they were able to halt the Russian offensive. However, if Ukrainians decide to send some of those transferred reserves back to Pokrovsk and Toretsk areas, and according to this article, some of those transfers have already begun, the Russian army could reactivate its northern plan. So what is going for the Russians on this front? Well, if the Ukrainian defenses collapse along this front, the Russian forces will once again be able to threaten the UAF's most important fortified areas in Kramatorsk and Sloviansk from the north, as they already tried to do in 2022. The drawbacks, however, are that Russia simply hasn't committed enough troops to the north to execute an operation of such scale. Further, all attempts to break through to the Ukrainian armed forces' defenses near Kupiansk or Siversk have not borne much fruit. Much of that territory is covered in forests and divided by large rivers. Further, the local infrastructure, namely a handful of roads from Russia's Belgorod region and environs, cannot support the supply of a large number of troops. Russian troops have already approached the main supply route of Vuhledar, which is the main fortified point in Ukraine's southern Donbas defenses. Additionally, they have captured the area of the city of Marinka and almost completely the city of Krasnohorovka to the north of Marinka. In the long term, this opens the door to attacks on Kurakhove, an important logistical hub for the entire southern Donbas. If Russia pursues this axis seriously and captures Vuhledar, it would radically enhance the security level for the Russian armed forces supply lines in southern Ukraine. Russian engineers have completed the construction of a railway from the Rostov region to Ukraine's occupied southern regions to reduce the army's dependence on supplies delivered over the Crimea Bridge. The farther the front advances from this railway, the more reliable it will be as a supply line. From the Kurakhove area, Russia could mount an offensive toward the Avdiivka front. The main drawback of such an offensive is that it wouldn't get Russia any closer to the main goal of capturing Kramatorsk and Sloviansk. Moreover, breaking through to Pokrovsk from the south would be challenging. At the end of the day, it is unlikely that losing Vuhledar would force Kiev to make any significant concessions. To the contrary, in the unlikely event that Ukraine is able to overcome its manpower and ammunition shortages and go on to exhaust Russian troops whilst at the same time forming a new strike group, it may have three counteroffensive options. One is a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. This will be the safest option as Russian troops there are not high in number and could be pushed back across the border with enough force. This will largely be a political victory, however, given Putin's public declaration that he wanted to create a buffer zone. It would also free up troops for other fronts. It's estimated that the defense of Kharkiv and Vovchansk has tied up some 8.5 brigades or 30 to 40,000 Ukrainian soldiers. The drawbacks, however, are quite obvious. Even if Ukraine is successful here, it is unlikely to force Kremlin into any compromises, as it would still be too insignificant to change Russia's war aims. Further, Ukraine risks getting bogged down in Kharkiv, which would mean no available reinforcements for its troops in the Donbas. Indeed, the most lucrative front is another stab at Zaporizhia to cut the land bridge. I have always said that this is the only real strategic opportunity Ukraine has for strategic victory against Russia. The problem is that everyone and the Russians know this, and it is the most defended area of the Russian armed forces defensive belt. Further, Moscow can send reserves at any moment. Most of all, another failure would be a crisis moment for the Ukrainian military, even worse than what occurred in the summer of 2023. The last opportunity will be a winter offensive for the Ukrainian army straight into central Donbas in an attempt to reverse Russia's recent gains. The goal would be to nullify all of Russia's recent gains. If successful, it may be enough to bring Russia to the table with Ukraine in a better position. Achieving this, however, would be near impossible if Russia ends up reaching Pokrovsk, as it will make it impossible to supply and stage a large Ukrainian strike group. Kiev's only hope is that they are able to stop Russia's current offensive in the interim. This may require the immediate use of reserves that Kiev has been building up for a future counteroffensive.